Good morning. As part of our 150th anniversary celebration year, today we are recognizing a Davenport native and member of this congregation, Ernest Oberholtzer. Ober's leadership during the struggle to preserve the boundary waters led to landmark legislation both in Canada and the United States. Along with his desire to preserve the natural beauty of this national treasure, he was also committed to preserving the culture of the native Ojibwe people. Joining me this morning are Beth Waterhouse, the Executive Director of the Oberholtzer Foundation, and members of our Green Sanctuary team, Kathy Wiedemann and Catherine Allen. We want to acquaint you with this amazing man, his landmark work, his beautiful island, and how his early life growing up in this Unitarian community influenced him for the rest of his life. The struggles he experienced 100 years ago continue today, unfortunately, as our natural spaces are still under attack. Let this sacred time begin. Please join me now for the chalice lighting. The words are in your order of service. In the light of truth and in the warmth of love, we gather to seek, to sustain, and to inspire. Now, if the young and young at heart would join me down front for words of all ages, please sit here on the floor in front of us.
Matty is short for what is your full long name?
Natasha.
Fred. My full name is Frederick.
Okay, there you go. That's exactly what I said. What's your name?
My nickname doesn't go to any of my names. My brother used to call me
Sunny?
Sunny Jim? Okay. Sunny Jim.
Well, this man up here, the name is, can you read that? It's
Ernest Oberholtzer.
Oberholtzer. It's a long name. Practice it, that's good. Oberholtzer. Ernest Carl. And when he got up northern Minnesota, they almost immediately started calling him Ober. Just plain old Ober. And so when he lived in this town, I would guess they called him Ernest. You know, that was more formal. And he was a young man then, but then when he went up north, he was called Ober. So we're here to talk a little bit about him. And he loved children. I think he would love to tell you some stories himself if he were still alive. He was about the age of my grandfather, and he is not with us anymore, but he loved to tell stories. One thing that we did when we were thinking about you guys is that we brought a little bit of the Northland down to you. Pass these around and look at these or feel them a little bit. This is from the North Woods. Let me just pull pull one apart a little bit. In there you might have a piece of pine from a tree up there. This is actually kind of a juniper. Doesn't smell much prickly. This one is a sacred piece called cedar, and there are a lot of cedars that grow on Mallard Island, this place where I work. In here I found there's a little bit of a feather. Look at this little thing. Look at this one. Look at this one. Little bird feather. I think. Little feather. So this is a little taste of the North Woods. We thought they might smell good. Some of them you can sort of smell the North. See what you smell.
Let's pass the bag so other people can smell
Pass
it
it
too.
around and just, that's the world that Ober moved to when he left Iowa. He went north 700 miles. He went up to that land where that is all. So he was a storyteller, and he loved to tell stories that the Indians told him. And he used to use the word Indian, although we say Anishinaabe now. That's another long word. But,
I thought you said Native American.
you know, and some of the native people up there were Canadian, so that they say First Nations. There's all these names, aren't there? Different names for the people we taught.
The natives gave him a nickname as well.
Oh, yeah, and then Oberholtzer had another name. This wasn't so much a nickname, because nicknames are like short names, but this was an honorary name. You ever thought of an honorary name? He was called Atisokan, which means storyteller or story gatherer. Atisokan. Can you say Atisokan? So lots about names and the land.
So we will be talking more up here about some of the things he did, but we wanted you to get a little smell and a little look at what the land was that he moved to when he left Davenport and moved on.
Up north, almost to Canada. We're half a mile from Canada.
Another thing that I'm aware of, it's not my nickname. It's there's this guy who sets the world record for the longest, it's a Guinness World Record for the longest name. People call him Mr. Wolf plus 585. I can't remember his full name. But his first name started with A, and then the next started with the other W. The W one was like the longest.
Amazing.
Good morning. I'm going to make some comments this morning and quote some words from the biography of Ernest Oberholtzer and also some of his own words. I gained this knowledge through reading this wonderful biography of Oberholtzer by Joe Paddock called Keeper of the Wild, and from two experiences up on at his home on Mallard Island. Ernest Oberholtzer, Ober, was born in Davenport in 1884 and died in 1997, and he is buried just down the street from us at Oakdale Cemetery. Between those two dates is the life of a man who lived a very full, abundant, and generous life. He is, unfortunately, an unsung hero of the environmental movement of the 20th century. Today, let's make him a sung hero. You will learn much about him from our speakers, so I will only touch lightly on a few aspects of Ober's life that I find especially inspiring. As a young boy, his appreciation of the natural world began by the way of two adults. One, a highly educated Harvard Unitarian minister, and two, an uneducated Irish gravedigger, who showed him the natural world around Oakdale Cemetery and Duck Creek. Ober's description of those places: the feel of the moss, the hollow of the tree, the smooth worn swimming hole, the swirling water, the gravel banks at the glen. At the age of 17, he had rheumatic fever, which left his heart damaged, and he was told at that time that he had about a year to live. So, he decided to set off for Harvard and study what interested him, and not too much more. And those studies ranged from philosophy to psychology to landscape architecture, and that was the one he said hit him just right. And regarding that damaged heart, throughout his life he pushed himself to the limit of his endurance, and he did live to be 93. No doubt the knowledge of the brevity of life, potentially, for him, increased his appreciation of the world and what he might accomplish while he was in it. As I see it, Ober took two great journeys in his life. One was a 5-month journey up into the wilderness north of Minnesota, and the second was a 9-year, extending into multiple decades, journey into the world of legal and political arena. On his trip up into the North Woods, he went into the largely unmapped area north of Minnesota, up into Rainy Lake, and beyond that, through many lakes and many portages, up to Hudson Bay, with his Ojibwe guide. He did have heart problems while he was on the way, but he wrote of that with every stroke of the paddle, I would feel a return to health. During this part of his life, he also became increasingly interested in the indigenous people, the Ojibwe. He was fascinated by their culture and legends and learned to speak their language. His second great journey was into the political and legal arena. When the vast interconnected waterways, and when you go home, look at a map of north of Minnesota, Rainy Lake, and all those thousands of lakes, large and small. All of this was threatened by the lumber baron, Edward Backus. So Ober took on the 9-year struggle when he might rather have stayed in his beautiful home and studied the ways of the indigenous people. But he took on Edward Backus, who was imposing, grandiose, arrogant, and indifferent to the destruction of the natural world. And he was determined to build a series of dams that would have created a huge single water basin out there that could be used for powering industry. Ober's leadership ensured the area's protection under landmark legislation both in the U.S. and Canada, and because of the work he and many others did, we now have Voyageurs National Park, the Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness Area in northern Minnesota, and Quetico Provincial Park in Canada. His environmental work went on for decades after that, and at the end of the life, he knew such efforts would never end. How true. Ober wrote, "It is not time to apologize, to speak in whispers. The hour has come to call out in ringing tones." And of Backus he wrote, he has perpetrated an unpardonable piece of arrogance. And Ober wrote of that fantastic lake area, "This is one of the rarest regions on the continent, if not the world. Nowhere else is there to be found so precious and picturesque a combination of water, rock, and forest, all linked together in a single maze of bewildering beauty." His home for over 40 years was on a tiny little island. When I went up there, this redefined small island for me. It's only about 1,000 feet long and almost wide enough to wrap your arms around. This was a place close to, in the wilderness, and close to the indigenous people he so admired, and a place filled with music, books, learning, and best of all, his friends. In his later years, he wrote, "Close friends of all sorts have occupied a large part of my life and still do." He created an island home where all were welcome. It was, and still is, a place for the integration of nature and culture, and a place of solace and retreat. In his later years, and not in great health, Ober wanted to go on a final lake journey to the highest place of his long-ago canoe trip to Hudson Bay, and also what he called a high point of his life. This was a place where he and his Ojibwe guide were the most lost on their initial trip. Despite that, and despite his poor health, he made it happen. His biographer, Joe Paddock, wrote, "Ober was quick-witted and intuitive, able to make much of little. His life was an abundant one, rich in adventure, culture, friendship, and accomplishment. His voice was one that expressed warmth and enthusiasm and intelligence." And I love this one. "His blue eyes shone in a 360-degree circle of interest." And Ober wrote, "Man was made for broad scenes and tall shadows. He craves a noble background. Cramp him, and he revolves in an ever-narrowing circle until finally he doubts his own destiny. Ober's circle was wide, and he lived his destiny." I am inspired by Ober in these ways. His openness to learning in his youth from a minister and a gravedigger. His eagerness to explore many subjects, despite having been told that he had only a year to live. His wanderlust and sense of adventure. His deep love for the wilderness and the essential importance of preserving it in its wild state. His deep appreciation of the indigenous people and of his many friends, and his determination toward the end of his life to take a last meaningful journey.
Hello, good morning. My name's Beth Waterhouse, and it is such an honor to sit with you and to consider the spirit of the community that once nurtured this fine man decades ago. And I will try to tell you a little bit more about him, and there are too many things to say, but let's start with this. Can you see this okay up here? I'll see if I can turn the pages. This is a photograph of Ernest and his younger brother Frank. Ernest Oberholtzer, who lived in this town, lived a sad life in this town for his first many years. Some lives are just given more than they can handle, I think, although he managed his way through it. By the time he was 7 years old, his parents had divorced, which was probably a pretty rare thing to do in those days. His father had then died, so he was never to see his father, Henry Reist Oberholtzer, again. And his little brother Frank fell, hit his head, and died at the age of 5. So dear Ernest and his mother Rosa became quite the duo, and they stayed close with each other for the rest of her life and was very important together. But that sad early beginning, I'm sure, set the tone for some of his life in Davenport. After the death of little Frank and the divorce, they moved, Rosa and Ober, moved to 6th and Perry Street. Now this is a photograph taken just a few years ago, in 2013, but the house then looked kind of more stately and like an old Iowa home. Check it out when you're in Davenport and look up at that house. That was the location of their home. This was, of course, her parents' home. Nice of them to take her in at that time, and that he lived with his grandparents. They were the Carls, thus his middle name is his mother's maiden name. So Ernest Carl and Sarah Markley Carl were his grandparents and lived there. They also are buried at the Oakdale Cemetery in the same plot. You will see in a moment, but I encourage you to go there too and find that site. She lived at 35 Oak Lane, so not far from where Connie lives now, in a little home. This was Oberholtzer's mailing address when he went to Harvard, and I think he came back and forth quite a bit until about 1916. When he decided to go north, Rosa soon followed him in the closeness of their relationship. For the summers only, she did not stay them into it. Here's Ernest at 13 when his brother had died and his mother was so grief-stricken. Her father, Ernest Carl, was kind enough to see that music was going to be part of the healing of their lives, and Rosa was already a trained pianist, and so he bought Ernest a violin so they could play duets, and sure enough, they did. Sooner or later, became pretty good at it. As Catherine said, and it's that element of Ober's life that is so ironic and such a marking place. There was that doctor's diagnosis after he had rheumatic fever at about age 17. He was given that inimitable 1 year to live, and of course he lived to age 93. But imagine having a life so determined by a diagnosis like that, so that every turn you would wonder if it was worth committing to this or committing to that. Should I give time to what should I give this precious time to? And he named it many, many years later as a turning point, as a very important element to the decisions that he made in his life. He did not go into a profession, he did not go into a career that needed a lot of education. He instead went north. And he decided to devote his life to exploration. He wanted to be known as an explorer. And in those days, there were still places to explore that had been as yet unexplored by the dominant European culture. When he was discovering or trying to find out where he should go explore, I mean, that's so interesting to me that the push to be the explorer came before he knew where he was going to go. But people said, well, in Northwest Canada, you'll still find Indigenous people who have not contacted the dominant white culture. They haven't had photographs taken. They haven't seen people of the white descent. So he wanted to go there and meet these Inuit people, and did. He would not have made the trip, however, without Te Tapasweritong, or Billy McGee, as was his store name, Anishinaabe man from Bad Vermilion Lake, a very strong man, a canoeist, birch bark canoes. He knew his way around the area. He was so good at camping, he could build a fire in any condition, and in that big year of 2,000 miles, they tested that fire building talent, believe me. 5 months, and they made it home. A book has been pulled together about this journey called Bound for the Barrens, which you can find at lulu.com or on Amazon, or I have a copy or two. But it's probably the book that Ober never wrote, and he would have liked to have seen it in print. Now back to Rainy Lake. When he decided to go up there, he didn't know what he was going to do for a living. Of course, he only had 1 year to live, so it didn't much matter. But then he got into using his landscape architecture skills and helping with one resort or another, helping someone to site a cabin on some property. And pretty soon those talents became known, and he was called into a project run by a man named Hapgood, who wanted to prove a little sustainable community up there. And he had about 50 acres of grassland, or 100. He had access to good land on a bigger island. And they went up there, they raised sheep, chickens, goats, had a little general store. Oberholtzer gave away a little too much, and he didn't make a go of it, and the company behind it decided not to capitalize it anymore. And when that project ended, they still owed Ober some wages. Instead of cash, they paid him in an island. So he was given Mallard Island. Now back to Arthur Judy, who was your ancestor here, and I would have liked to have known that man. By the year 1921, Judy had retired and was still corresponding with Oberholtzer, and that proves their friendship, I think, that they were more than passing friends. And the context for this slide is that Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, had contacted Judy to see if he knew of anyone who would be useful for their new Antioch plan. And said Arthur Judy about Ernest Oberholtzer. When I noted that the trustees were searching for men of that pioneering spirit to launch the plan, I thought, Ernest is just such a man. And this was the Antioch plan he's referring to. Mallard Island was given to him in lieu of wages, that 1,000-foot island that Catherine went to and that I work at. And, it is indeed tiny. If you walk 5 times the length of it, you can walk for a mile. So you have to kind of go back and forth. But it's always possible to get out in a rowboat and get your perspective and see it from the lake. This building was called Bird House. It was built in 1926 and really was the first of the Ober designed houses. He wanted a tower of a house for one reason or another, and he told his Swedish builder to build this, and Emil Johnson said, it won't stand. You can't do it that way. And Ober said, well, make it stand. So he cabled it to the rocks with steel cables, and it's still cabled to the rocks. Beautiful place to stay. Here we go. This was the first house he built. It was fondly called Japanese House out on the end of the island. Kind of a scrappy looking thing by the time this picture was taken. And this is Japanese House today. We saved the little center of it and turned it into a beautiful little studio meditation house. Not a sleeping place, but Japanese house. It's a beloved spot. Look at the beauty of that light. This is Ober's big house. By the time the late 30s came about, his mother had passed away. He ran into a little bit of money from the sale of a building, I believe, here in Davenport. Built the big house, 3 stories into the side of the rock. There it is in the late 60s, I believe. And here it is today. This picture was just taken a month ago. So you know that it's still there and it's still beautiful in a new kind of a way. Love the blue sky of that day. But what did Ober stand for? It's so hard to bring that together. Catherine did a good job of what he accomplished and what he meant in the world. And I tried to just talk about his values just a little bit. He did not stand for the industrialist view of nature. He was working against that. So his values were of nature as an entity, as a community of beings. He worked for policies that would protect wild places, not just parks, but wild places, and indeed wilderness over parks. He saw the value of the canoe, the backpack, and the quiet way of being on the land. Respecting not only the land, but the land with the lifestyle of the indigenous peoples that for some reason, even in the 20s and 30s, he saw as part and parcel to the health of the land was the way that the Indians used it and had used it for centuries and lived with the land. On the island, you can tell that he loved to learn through experience, not through just books, and he also believed in teaching experientially. And then Mallard is such an example of his value of blending culture with nature. So up there, you don't just see a wild place, but you see a wild place with 12,000 books that he collected. A wild place with piano music, a wild place with a very good collection of opera, a wild place with the ability to make good food and eat together in community. So that strange mixture of nature and culture. Today, the island is run by a foundation. We share it for 12 weeks each summer with all kinds of people: artists, researchers, historians, architects, ecologists, gardeners, carpenters. The happenstance of each summer is like a quilt. And all of us come together to help this man's life continue, to help it last, and help his legacy of the island last as long as we can. We know it's ephemeral, but to help it last. And I'm glad that Catherine shared her personal experiences, because it does change lives. It changes people. They're given time to think and time to create and time to be, and the stories ripple out. And then Oberholtzer honored his roots in Davenport and asked that his body be returned to the cemetery there with his mother and grandparents. So you can tell how important Davenport was to him. And there is an image of Plot that's just down the street. Rosa Oberholtzer with his lovely nickname Ober, and their family together. His grandparents, his mother, his brother, his uncle, as we learned, who died very young also. So he brought it back home to Davenport. Thank you again for the honor of being part of all this.
Ja, det shikes. She Regina Tsosie. And I need this a shiki bashes chin, to the chini dash che, to a hana dash another, Yat no son, yat John Hay, yat the end in the yat Avene, I want to share a song with you today. It's called a Heartbeat Drum Song, but before I share it with you, I wanted to explain a little bit about our traditional drum here. This is a hand drum, and we honor our hand drum because it was once a living thing. You know, the hide was once an animal, living animal, and the frame is part of a living tree. So we honor our hand drums and our big grandfather, grandmother drums that we use in social gatherings or powwows or different ceremonies. And the drum is like the heartbeat of our community, because for us, when we hear it beat, it reminds us of our heart beating, and that we send those heartbeats, out to the four directions, and out to Mother Earth, out to Father Son, and those creations between Grandfather Sky and Mother Earth. So we continue that. And this song I'm going to share was written by an indigenous group of women called Eulali, and they are from the Sakoni Nation. And the words I'm going to translate here. 100 years have passed. I hear the distant beat of my father's drum. I hear his drums throughout the land. His beat I feel within my heart. The drum shall beat, so my heart shall beat, and I shall live 100,000 years.
Thank you so much, Regina. That was fabulous. Downstairs in the display case, you're going to see some memorabilia and photos that I pulled together with the help of our archive team here and also from Beth up at the island. One of the items that I found in the archive was a note that was received here in 1977. In his will, Ober had designated $200 be given to the church in honor of Reverend Arthur Judy. So thinking back 70 years to this influential man when he was 7 years old as the minister of the congregation. The note indicates the congregation had no idea who he was. And so they started doing some research about him because they didn't know who this money was coming from. When Ober moved to the house on 6th and Perry with his parents, he became acquainted with Reverend Judy and was going to the Unitarian Church, which was just up the hill at 9th and Perry. We don't know if the Carls were active in this congregation. However, it's not hard to imagine that a sad, very intelligent boy who's just wandering around would be attracted to this charismatic man. He was greatly influenced by him and immediately joined the youth group that Reverend Judy started when he founded the Outing Club, which still exists right on Brady Street. Beth and I stopped there yesterday and were given the books of their history and found out some new things that neither of us knew about Ober and his background. One of the things the Outing Club did at that time was sponsor a lot of canoeing and camping trips. So this was his first taste of the outdoors, and had this mentor who was willing to be a father replacement for him in these adventures. He loved everything about the outdoors: hiking, camping, exploring along the Mississippi River and Duck Creek River, plants and animals, except he hated organized sports. So that was not his interest. Catherine has mentioned Keeper of the Wild by Joe Paddock. And Joe mentions that even though he wrote and talked little about Unitarianism, it's clear that everything that followed in Ober's life was really built on those liberal and well-defined values of the Unitarian Church, which included the respect for the interconnected web of life. This was an early permeation in his consciousness. Also, the religious pluralism that Unitarians embraced grounded him in what was spiritual and allowed him to really open his mind later to all religious traditions, but prepared him to accept fully the traditions that he was exposed to by the Ojibwe in the Native American religion. Paddock also suggests that this early exposure to Unitarianism may have also created the root of distrust he had about Christian religions that talked about missionaries and the zeal to convert, because he thought it was very detrimental to the native spirituality and culture, and he saw this evidence clearly later in his life. As we've talked about before, he became acquainted with Rainy Lake. He started exploring. He was really drawn to this idea of getting to know the indigenous people and whether he could make a living off of it, which he couldn't, but he decided to really make that his focus of his life, to live among the native people for long periods of time. Beth and I were talking last night, and she said everybody else came to the natives asking for things. I need pelts, I need this, I need that. He said, just give me your stories. That's what he would ask. By 1915, he had a permanent home on Rainy Lake, but it just depended on where he could find a place to live. He was well respected by his native friends for his generosity, and they gave him the name Atasoken, meaning legend or teller of legends. As he immersed himself in his culture, he also made it his responsibility to save that culture and record that culture for future generations, so that all of us have the ability to see and hear and know these stories that may have been lost otherwise. The Ojibwe saw themselves as another element of nature, no greater or no less than everyone else on earth. They saw their existence intertwined with the rest of the earth, so their religion gave deeper meaning to every plant, animal, and dream. He embraced this way of looking at the natural world. He said, "I would see and hear all these things from Indians, and I often think they have a wisdom we don't have. If we ever had it, we've forgotten it. We've been reared entirely on the idea that nothing is true unless we can prove it. We shut our minds to the spiritual things." Many Ojibwe believe that Ober's immersion in the healing traditions, along with the spiritual understanding of nature, was possibly the reason that he outlived that one-year death sentence that he received at age 17. So he lived to the age of 93, despite that heart condition. One of the things that I found in our archive also was a sermon given by Wendy Jerome to her Unitarian congregation in 2002 up in Minnetonka. Her parents and her aunt and uncle were great friends of Ober and spent many visits at the island. She said that when you think about this man, this diminutive man that made such a difference, she said, it is hard to believe that this world might not be available to us as you think about the watershed. We have today Voyagers, Boundary Waters, Canadian Quetico, largely through the efforts of this one unassuming, 5'6", 130-pound, gentle little man who just happened to be in the right place at the right time, who realized he was needed, put aside all other concerns, and gave his whole life to winning this wilderness. It resulted in the passage of the Shipstead-Nolan Act and future legislation that was based on this. It was truly a case of David versus Goliath, a lumber baron, multi-millionaire, living in a mansion within a 10-15-minute canoe ride from Ober's little island with hand-built houses from scavenged material and collected books. As we listen to these stories, it's exciting for me to recollect that all of these experiences later came from the beginnings of his Unitarian beliefs. We recognize and acknowledge the interdependence of the interdependent web of all existence as a part of our traditions, just as the Ojibwe saw themselves as no greater or less than anything on earth. So as I was trying to pull all these things together and seeing these similarities, I remembered a book that I had read years ago called Common Fire, Leading a Life of Commitment in a Complex World. There was 4 points that I remembered from this book, so I went and grabbed it off my shelf. I don't have 12,000 books in my library, but getting close. So, the first is a commitment to a common good, holding strong convictions, but not being a fanatic. The second is perseverance and resilience. As we listen to his story and we hear this ongoing battle for 30 years, his life was never the same after that. The third is the willingness to really take a critical look at our culture and the long-term implications beyond the issue. And I can't emphasize how important this is, to take the long view. And that seems to be something we're lacking right now, or that's at risk right now. And finally, the point that speaks most directly to what we've learned today is the ethical congruence between our life and work. All the people that they describe in this book and the people that we have heard about, the Ojibwe and Ober, shared a quality and energy that showed a seamlessness between what they professed and how they lived their lives. I think that seamlessness is the thought that I want to leave with you today.
Well, we've heard a lot about Ober today, haven't we? He's become a legend in the protection of our wildest spaces and how he continues to inspire us to stay connected to the natural world. is really beyond compare. In addition to his legacy, the legacy of his relationship to the Ojibwe Indian tribe, and his enduring presence in the boundary waters at Mallard Island, the Wilderness Society, which he helped to found, presses on to carry his and other works forward. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the Wilderness Society today, but also talk a little bit about where his work has gone and how it applies to us today in our congregation and our lives. The Wilderness Society was formed in 1935. It was crucial in drawing up and passing the 1964 Wilderness Act, creating a national wilderness preservation system which really protects the wildest part of our country within our parks. The Act immediately protected almost 9 million acres of true wilderness area from coast to coast. There are now nearly 110 million acres of wilderness, representing less than 2% of the land in the lower United States and less than 20% of the 640 million acres that are federally protected as national parks, forests, and refuges. When President Johnson signed the bill into law, creating these areas, he stated, "If future generations are to remember us with gratitude rather than contempt, we must leave them something more than the miracles of technology." This is 1964. "We must leave them a glimpse of the world as it was in the beginning, not just after we got through with it." He was, and the Congress of the 88th Congress were really responsible for so much of our environmental protection. The mission of the Wilderness Society is to protect wilderness and inspire Americans to care for our wildest places. We contribute to better protection, stewardship, and restoration of our public lands, preserving our natural legacy for current and future generations. At one time, 85% of Iowa was covered with tall grass prairie. Less than 1% of that remains intact. Only 4% of our wetlands, 18% of our surface waters, and 43% of our forests remain. These remnants of natural habitat harbor 90% of the state's plant and animal diversity. Most existing prairie now are small. The Les Hills perhaps is clearly the largest. It runs along the Missouri River in western Iowa for 200 miles. It has the largest prairie tracts left in the state, ranging from a few acres to 3,000 acres, totaling 640,000 acres. 96% of this landform, however, is still in private ownership. Iowa does not have any federally designated wilderness. Only about 2% of Iowa's 36 million acres are permanently protected, which amounts to about 7 million acres. There are 5 national wildlife refuges in Iowa, 85 state parks, 10 state forests, and 453 wildlife management areas. Illinois is virtually tied with Iowa in last place for remnant native prairie. We both have less than 1% of native prairie. In 1820, Illinois had 22 million acres of prairie land and 14 million acres of forest. Prairies were mainly in the northern 2/3 of the state, the forests in the southern 1/3. By 1900, most of Illinois' prairies were gone. The majority of these lands were converted to agriculture. By 1978, less than 2,300 acres of high-quality prairie remained in the state. So do we have areas that need further protection? Or perhaps are we firmly in the next stage of the life of wildlands and wild habitat? The recreation, rehabilitation, and recovering of these areas. And I think the answer is both. And fortunately, there are many examples. In Iowa, a program that is probably less well known, I think we all know of programs that are around to help protect land and restore land, but one that some of our congregation members have become involved in is something called the IRVM, which is the Integrated Roadside Vegetation Management. Iowa was one of the first states to be involved in this, beginning in the mid-1970s. The goal of the IRVM is to provide an alternative to conventional roadside management practices, which at one time included the extensive use of mowing and herbicides, were costly and frequently ineffective, and contributed to an increased potential for surface water contamination. Today, IRVM integrates the use of native and other select types of vegetation with appropriate management techniques to produce cost-effective, environmentally sound management. To date, more than 50,000 acres of federal, state, county, and city roadsides in Iowa have been planted to native grasses, wildlife, and other types of vegetation. Progress in preservation and restoration has also been made in Illinois, and again, I'm sure you're aware of many. But one of the most recent involves Midween National Tallgrass Prairie, which is a prairie reserve and United States national grassland operated by the United States Forest Service. It is in northeastern Illinois, near the towns of Elwood, Manhattan, and Wilmington. It's the first national tallgrass prairie ever designated in the U.S. and the largest conservation site in the Chicago wilderness area. It started as a 400-acre discovery of native prairie on the site of the Joliet Army Ammunition Plant. And it now encompasses about 4,000 acres. And you can visit there. Part of our wildness and part of Ober's vision was how to have people become involved and how we can connect to the wildness without destroying it. And now we're in the process of recreating it. As members of UUCQC, we can ask if any of our concept of wildness or wilderness can be applied to our congregational space. And we can probably honestly say that our land is no longer considered wilderness. How many of you would tend to agree with that? Although I suspect there are areas in that forest, that deep, dark forest behind the garage that looks wild, but has probably been someone's home in the recent history. Instead, we've become part of the reclaim and restore movement in small but important ways. We have a small patch of prairie plants in the northeast corner of our lawn. We have a circular pollinator planting, which exists near the community entrance. Our first meeting of what was to become known as the Giving Garden was in February of 2014. As part of establishing that garden, we noticed a large area between the garage and the parking lot that was virtually a weed pile. It was invasive species and brush and actually a lot of asphalt. We cleaned that out. And I think Olivia Dorothy even discovered a new sidewalk as we excavated and restored that land. So it felt like an archaeologic site. We rebuilt the soil and decided to put a pollinator garden in that area. The initial planting was part of a gift from F. Traylor's Memorial and milkweed from Arnold Lindemann's own garden. For the past 2 years, we have found monarch caterpillars that have been protected inside the church to subsequently become butterflies. It became at that moment clear to me that not only are we recreating in small ways our own original landscape, but we are clearly becoming the part of the life cycle of creatures whose survival is threatened because of our own grievous mishandling of our own wild homes. It's estimated that only about 1 of 100 monarch caterpillars survive to butterfly stage in the wild. While it is unclear whether human activities that improve the chance a butterfly will emerge from a chrysalis will reverse the pace of extinction of monarchs, it is definitely unclear, and that is definitely unclear. But what is clear is that we are responsible in many significant ways for the success or failure of species of animals and insects. An important way we connect on a daily basis to our original wildness is simply to step outside and pause for the moment, to listen to what is natural, feel the sun and the wind, and adore the stars and the moons, and observe the lives that live outside our usual context. William Shakespeare wrote, "And this, our life exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. One touch of nature makes the whole world kin. Just as Ober has shown us how terribly important it is for us to protect areas minimally impacted by human trammel, I learned that trammel is different than trampling on. Trammel means untouched or not managed by humans. It is very important for us to instill a love and appreciation for the outside in our children. One of the first signs of spring is the joyful sound of our young people in our congregation when we hear through the windows during our service their enjoyment of the outside. 3 years ago, our youth education team created a new space near the Giving Garden to be a playground and a sanctuary without walls, where the floor is the grass and the sky is the ceiling. I'd like to end by sharing a list. So many of the lists we've heard lately are lists of anger and sadness. This is a list of joy and hope. It is a list of places near us in Iowa and Illinois where I'm sure many of you have been and where you may for a moment become one with the wild. Scott County Park, Black Hawk State Historical Site, Devil's Glen Park, Duck Creek Bike Path, Schützen Park, Sunderbrook Park, Sylvan Island, Credit Island Park, Loud Thunder Preserve, Lost Grove Lake, Mississippi Thompson Fulton Sand Prairie. We can thank Ober for showing us the way. Would you now please all join me in reading in unison an Ojibwe prayer. In your order of service, Grandfather, look at our brokenness. We know that in all creation, only the human family has strayed from the sacred way. We know that we are the ones who are divided, and we are the ones who must come back together to walk in the sacred way. Grandfather, Sacred One, teach us love, compassion, and honor, that we may heal the earth and heal each other.
Please join me now to extinguish our chalice. The words are in your order of service. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.